arguments. Are God of the gaps arguments always invalid? A logical fallacy, like some people claim? I'm going to argue no. They're a category of argument that can be either valid or invalid depending on the circumstances. And it's a mistake to dismiss God of the gaps arguments. Now let's start with the definition, or actually let's start by saying why I look so rough today. I have a small part in a church play, and I'm playing a rough customer, so I'm growing a beard and I'm looking rough. But besides that, let's move to the God of the gaps definition. God of the gaps is an argument for God's existence, which says that gaps in scientific knowledge can be evidence of supernatural action as an explanation for events in the natural universe. So God of the gaps argument is based on a gap in scientific knowledge for something that happens in the natural world. And we say, well, that's evidence of a supernatural act, thus evidence for God. And people have dismissed these arguments unfairly, and it's one of those things that sounds reasonable on the surface, but if you are willing to think just a little bit, they're really not handling this category of argument correctly. Consider what would happen, for example, if Jesus appeared at a wedding feast today and repeated his miracle of the wedding at Cana. He made the water into wine, the best wine. And I turn to an unbeliever and I say, Jesus turned that water into wine by using supernatural power. And this is evidence for the existence of God. Now, this would be a God of the gaps claim. That is, there's no reasonable natural explanation for how the water became wine. And I'm using the absence of such an explanation to support my argument that it's a supernatural act, thus indicating God exists. Classic God of the gaps argument. There's no doubt that I'm using such an argument. But I hope you'd agree that in this case, in this instance, my argument is sound, whether it's a God of the gaps argument or not. The fact is that science, natural science, operates using something called methodological naturalism. That is, it is a search for natural causes only. It considers natural causes only. It can never prove an action had a supernatural cause. It's not designed to do that, friends. The methodological naturalism, the scientific method using that, could not detect God if God were standing right in front of it. So, because it assumes all causes are natural in an effort to find natural causes. So, even here where Jesus performs a genuine miracle right in front of you, right in front of others, there's no scientific way to prove that it was the result of a supernatural action. The best science can say is we currently have no reasonable natural explanation for this phenomenon, but we'll keep looking. In other words, it becomes a gap in scientific knowledge. And I would be appealing to a gap in scientific knowledge to propose a supernatural explanation to support the idea that God exists. I would be doing a God of the gaps argument, and there's nothing wrong with that in this instance. And I hope the reader will see that if God of the gaps arguments are always invalid, then no evidence for miracles from the natural universe, even overwhelming direct evidence, could ever be considered valid. It's a rhetorical trick people are playing with themselves to avoid having to consider valid evidence for the existence of God, in my opinion. Because it's a backdoor way of basically imposing methodological naturalism. That is, for the purpose of our search for a natural cause, we'll assume natural causes only. That's methodological naturalism. And turn it into philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is different from the tool of methodological naturalism in that it is an a priori assumption, an assumption that nature is all that there is, that all acts must have natural causes because nature is all there is. And it's subtly taking methodological naturalism and turning it into philosophical naturalism. It does this because any appeals to gaps in science's knowledge is, oh, that's God of the gaps argument. I don't even have to think about it. I don't have to consider your evidence. And that's begging the question in the extreme. If you think about it, that's what it's doing. It's begging the question. If you'll only accept scientific evidence for supernatural action, and science by definition can't show that any act had a supernatural cause, it's checkmate. Your reasoning is circular. You sealed yourself off by cliche from any honest consideration of evidence of supernatural action in the natural universe. So, in my opinion, the honest way to consider this subject is to admit that, at least in theory, there's more than one possible reason for a, quote, gap in scientific knowledge. The gap in scientific knowledge could exist because there is a natural cause and we just don't know enough. We just haven't found it yet. That's going to ordinarily be the case. But another possible reason that we haven't found a natural cause for something is that there is no natural cause. It was the result of a supernatural act. That's the other possibility. And if you assume that all actions have natural causes, period, then you're a philosophical naturalist. You can't consider the evidence for supernatural action. You can't do it fairly because your assumptions about reality do not permit you to. So if that's the case with you, if someone listening falls into that category, forgive me, I want to suggest a non-scientific solution. Sincerely ask God, if he's real, that he free your mind so that you can fairly consider whether or not he's real. And then let's see what happens. Let's see if there's some event in your life or occurrence in your life that has or thought in your head that doesn't have a natural explanation. You see, I've seen people engage, and it's so sad. I've seen people engage in all sorts of mental evasions in order to try to keep their thinking wrapped in this tight little circle, which prevents them to fairly consider the question. They may say, well, okay, the miracle has to be verifiable. And then you poke around a little bit as to what they mean by verifiable. And eventually, if they continue the discussion, it's found that they mean it has to be scientifically verifiable. So, well, once again, the circle closes again. You're right back to demanding that the supernatural cause of an act be determined by a method which, by definition, is unable to consider or detect supernatural causes. I call that sealing themselves off from truth. I see it all the time. It's very sad, but it's not uncommon. So there is an argument, though. They say, well, what about the history? There's an historical argument for dismissing all God of the gaps arguments. That is, they can show a long line of natural causes that have been displaced. And we said, oh, this was a supernatural event. And oh, we found a natural cause, and so your supernatural explanation has been displaced. And that happened regularly for, let's say, 200-300 years. Now, I am a student of history. I believe we should learn the lessons of history, but we need to learn them properly and always using reason as our guide. Isn't it obvious why, at the beginning of the age of science, this occurred so regularly? Because we didn't know about the laws of nature then. We were just discovering things with science. So, yes, as our knowledge of science grew, things moved from this category of, well, maybe God did it, to, well, if he did, it was by his law and not by direct intervention. But most of reality, we hadn't found a scientific explanation for yet. And as we found more and more scientific explanations, naturally that category grew, and the other category of things we think God might be doing directly shrank. But that is to be expected. That's just because science didn't know anything 300 years ago, and they start to know more and more. So I think we're now reaching the point where the pendulum is beginning to swing the other direction. That is, there are some subjects where our knowledge is increasing, but the natural explanations grow less likely the more we learn about it, not more likely. For example, that's true on the smallest scale with living cells, and it's true on the largest scale with the astonishing fine-tuning of the universe and the fundamental forces, and in certain aspects of evolution and certain periods where it seems to go much faster than the mechanisms proposed for it can take it. So there are, as we learn more, some things that we said, well, maybe God did that. No, it's obvious he didn't, at least by direct action. But there's other places where, gee, we're starting to learn about this, and we actually have reached the part where if there were a natural cause, we should have some inkling of what it is by now, and every idea we test seems to fail. So I would say the rise of science has produced this swinging of the pendulum on that case. And just now, when we're reaching the case where God of the Gaps arguments are really more likely than ever to be sound, people aren't considering them because they're dismissing them based on bad reasoning. And I would also add as an aside that, God isn't just God of the gaps. We're not saying, Christians are not saying, God found this universe complete with natural laws all set up and he decided to intervene in it from time to time. He is God of the gaps, and he's God of everything in between the gaps. He wrote the laws, and he can suspend the laws. So really the whole idea has sometimes been miscategorized. In fact, God of the gaps really has more than one meaning. The other meaning is used by Christians in a completely different sense. But today I'm talking about the sense that is used in debate primarily by doubters. So God can act through nature, or he can act in her, and we understand that. And we understand that it should be that proposed natural explanations grow with our understanding of the natural universe and our increase of knowledge. But if a question has been well studied and or we think we know enough about a subject to where we could find a natural explanation and it's still not there, then it's perfectly valid to suggest, unless you're a naturalist, unless you just right out of the gate say, no supernatural explanations can exist. And then you're being unfair. You're really not being open-minded. You're not being reasonable. You're imposing an assumption on the data that's really the very question we're discussing. So that is the issue with God of the gaps. And this is not, usually I talk about Christ in early Genesis. I don't talk about logic and philosophy very often. I really prefer to talk about the work of Christ being shown in early Genesis. And that's what my book is about. But because it does involve some things that can be dismissed as God of the gaps arguments, it compels me to address this mishandling of the category.